Today on episode 79, I have for you the first part of a two-part series about paying off your student loan debt. I'm certain that a large majority of you listening have some form of student loan debt, and as a new teacher, you're probably trying to figure out how you're going to pay it off with your new salary. What if I told you that some of you could pay as little as $100 a month and have all of your debt taken care of in 10 years? Sounds too good to be true, right? Well, Travis Hornsby from the Student Loan Planner tells us not only why we're entitled to do this, but also how we can save tens of thousands of dollars on our debt.
Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, where we help new and beginning teachers navigate through those crazy first years of teaching so you can maintain your sanity and personal life. Here's your host, Kim Lepre.
Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kim Lepre, and this is the podcast for new and beginning teachers who don't want to just survive those first few years, but actually thrive. I'm so happy you joined me today since I have a seriously valuable episode that you definitely want to stick around until the end for. As I mentioned in the introduction, Travis Hornsby from the StudentLoanPlanner.com and the Student Loan Planner podcast is with me to discuss how teachers can get out from under the burden of student debt. Now, Travis founded Student Loan Planner after helping his wife, who's a physician, navigate ridiculously complex student loan repayment decisions. And to date, he's consulted on almost $500 million in student loan debt personally, more than anyone else in the country. He's a chartered financial analyst, and he brings his background as a former bond trader trading billions of dollars. Now, before we dive into the interview, I wanted to let you guys know about an upcoming conference just for new teachers. Are you paying attention? It's called the New Educator Weekend, and it's being held in two locations, in San Diego from December 6th through the 8th, and Santa Clara, California from February 21st to the 23rd. These conferences have everything that you need to be successful in your first few years of teaching, with sessions covering topics like classroom management, IEPs, working with colleagues, admin and parents, Common Core and state standards, and how to build your teaching career. Now, I'll be at both of those conferences, both as a presenter and exhibitor for this podcast, so I definitely encourage you to sign up. And I would love to meet you and hear about how your first year is going. So for more information and to sign up, head over to teachersneedteachers.com/conference, where you'll see information about the southern one in San Diego and the northern one in Santa Clara.
Hi, I'm Dan Kreiness, host of the Leader of Learning podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Well, thank you, Travis, for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Kim. Excited.
Now, I thought your story about helping your wife figure out how to pay her six-figure student loan debt was really cute. And I'm pretty sure that every person who listens to my podcast has student loan debt. So they're definitely going to be interested in hearing about how they can get out from under this just heavy burden of debt. But just some background first. So why were student loan forgiveness programs created in the first place?
Well, it's to incentivize people to do jobs that pay less than other opportunities, right? I mean, that's kind of the main goal, is to give somebody a little bit of, debt forgiveness where they don't have to go out and feel like they have to make $80,000 a year, being a salesperson or working in tech, or, because we need teachers, right? And the problem is that people that graduate have the same bachelor's degree debt, regardless if you pursued engineering or teaching, And so that's clearly a problem if you're making $30,000 or $40,000 or $45,000, depending on what part of the country you're in, starting out. To pay back $30,000 or $40,000 on that kind of income is way tougher than to pay it back on, a higher income. So that's kind of the original reason for having some sort of forgiveness programs at all in the first place. I'm talking about kind of way back in the day before any of the sort of modern forgiveness programs came into play.
So if you're going to go to graduate school or med school or anything like that, you're going to be in debt forever. Just because you make six figures as like a physician doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to pay back those loans.
Right. And you mentioned graduate degree or master's degrees. Like that's where we see teachers with the big debts, like the teachers that just have the bachelor's degrees, they have the kind of the same debts that everybody else has. And so it's not really like a super unusual strategy for most people if you have 30 or 40,000 in debt. Although you can still save a lot more money than you would think using some of these loan forgiveness programs.
Now, from what I've heard, there are some student loan forgiveness programs that are actually for teachers. Can you explain how those are unique?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bazillion like state specific programs or programs like specific to your local district, but then the main one at the federal level is called teacher loan forgiveness. So this is administered, by basically the loan servicer says, do you have 5 years of service as a highly qualified teacher? And basically most teachers can get that serving in any capacity for about $5,000 worth of loan forgiveness. And then the teachers that are highly qualified for special education, either at the elementary or secondary level, they can get that that $17,500 level, which is a lot higher. So actually, I have a cousin that's a special ed teacher pursuing that $17,500 version. And then if you're a secondary math or science teacher, then you can also get that $17,500 number. So the number of teachers that can get teacher loan forgiveness for that almost 20 grand figure is actually relatively small, because obviously like there's not, that's a small piece of the pie of all teachers, like highly qualified secondary math, science, and special ed. And then, most teachers could get that $5,000 level of forgiveness. But the problem is that even though it's called teacher loan forgiveness, it's actually often, like more often than not, it's actually like the worst repayment forgiveness plan.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And I was thinking when I heard that there was even one for teachers that it was kind of too good to be true. So I was just curious, like, what are the pros and cons of using that teacher one? And also something that I thought about today is, are there any tax implications if your loans are forgiven?
No, not really. I mean, not for the public and federal programs, Okay. So for the, like, if you work in the private sector, then there are tax implications. But if you're in a not-for-profit or government world, then there's not. There's also like some grants, which I'm not quite as familiar with as the forgiveness programs. But there was a big scandal where these grants got converted into loans because of some like silly paperwork error that, just the loan servicer messed up. And so, it's just kind of amazing to me that the programs that are specifically created for teachers are absolute abject failure. We have a lot of people, emailing us all the time. Like we have pretty good data on this stuff. Like the teacher forgiveness programs are unnecessarily complicated. They're not very generous at all compared to the programs that exist for people like physicians. So, you've got situations where, these forgiveness programs that are designed for physicians, you can get $400,000 forgiven. And meanwhile, a teacher is just scraping by trying to get $5,000 forgiven for working at a Title I school. It's just totally patently poorly designed. Whoever the people were that wrote these bills clearly didn't care a lot about teachers, or they just had no clue what they were doing.
Especially when you're starting out as a teacher, a lot of teachers start out upper 20s, low 30s. And now, they have to pay back how many tens of thousands of debt, and they can barely pay their bills. So yeah, it is a little bit unfair to just give us at most. I mean, I would still be grateful for that 17,000, but at the same time, I'd still have another, 40 or so thousand to go. So then are there any alternatives to the teacher loan forgiveness program that, like I can qualify for?
Yeah. So basically anybody that's got more than $20,000 probably needs to not do teacher loan forgiveness. So here's the reason why. So for example, you're eligible for something called pay as you earn. So pay as you earn is probably the best option for somebody pursuing public service loan forgiveness. So what that means is you're going to pay 10% of your income after a deduction for like how big your family is, right? So if you're single, that deduction is about 20 grand. You can add about $5,000 for every person in your family in terms of how big that deduction is. So for example, most teachers that make $20,000 or $30,000 a year under the pay as you earn plan, they're going to be paying 10% of like their income minus that like 20K deduction. So that could literally be like $50 or $100 a month, right? Like we're talking like a really small payment. Now, here's where it gets tricky. If you sign up for that teacher loan forgiveness program, did you know that those 5 years do not count towards the 10 years needed for public service loan forgiveness?
I didn't know that.
So a lot of teachers get screwed over big time this way. They sign up for the $5,000 teacher loan forgiveness, which is like $1,000 per year for 5 years, right?
Right.
And so they commit to that. They get the $5,000 forgiven. So their 40 goes to 35. And then they find out that all of that time they could have been just paying like 50 to $100 a month. And they would only have needed 5 more years, and all 40,000 could have been forgiven instead of just 5.
I've never heard of that.
Pretty crazy, right? Yeah. So teachers get, I should, call it like the teacher 15-year trick, because basically teachers get tricked by like government stupidity and bureaucracy, the way they name these things. They get tricked into signing up for, especially teachers with larger debts than 20K,
Mm-hmm.
The teachers that have these larger debts than 20K, they get suckered into signing up for teacher loan forgiveness because it's literally named after teachers. So you would just,
yeah, it's logical.
It's logical to sign up for the one named after you, right? And then what they do is they do that 5-year period, and they find out that their payments don't count towards PSLF because they were pursuing teacher loan forgiveness. And then they're stuck like doing an extra 10 years to get their loans wiped. And that's like not, I guess, the worst thing in the world if you're a, career teacher, but like,
right.
I mean, but it's super unfair regardless. And second, there's a lot of teachers that will be in the field like 10 years, or like 15 years, like they won't necessarily spend their entire career as an education professional. Yeah. So, that's just kind of screw somebody over where like they feel like they're stuck even longer, which I don't think that they thought through, that from an evil master plan, like to trap teachers in the profession, but that's kind of what it does.
Well, and then you're paying 5 more years than necessary.
Exactly. Yeah. You just keep it around where it could have been out of your life. Like most teachers probably start, right after graduating, right? So like early 20s, you could be free from your debt by your early 30s. Or if you make these mess ups, like we see most people do, you're free more like in your late 30s because you're probably doing a little bit of forbearance. You're maybe on an ineligible plan. That's a big problem we see people do. And then there's like more complicated stuff like being on the wrong tax filing status. So for example, let's say that, you're a teacher, a lot of teachers get married, right? That's a thing. Right. So, you get married, let's say you get married to somebody that doesn't have any student loan debt, right? So you can file taxes, married filing separately, and exclude their income from your payment calculation for your loans. So what happens is a lot of people, like they're paying $50 to $100 a month, they're single, and then they get married, and that payment goes from like $50 to $100 a month to like $400 a month, which is their standard plan. That's the one that they have you pay off in 10 years.
Right.
So instead of having to pay $400, you could file your taxes separately and keep that $50 to $100 a month payment on the right repayment plan, pay as you earn.
Which means that you're actually going to pay down less and more will be forgiven in the long run.
Like ding, ding, ding. Yeah.
I don't know why they don't tell us this sooner.
It's
or at all. They don't tell anybody.
Well, it's super complicated, right? So like, let's kind of talk about how like teachers kind of get screwed over. So we were talking before we pressed the record. My dad's a teacher, or was a teacher. He retired. He taught for 40 years. And this is the typical interaction with financial professionals, right? Some like high fee, like, commission salesperson comes to the teacher lounge like during lunch and gives away free pizza. And all the teachers like, oh yeah, free stuff, like my favorite, And so they try
happens.
Yeah. And they try to put you into like super high commission, insurance products. And the insurance person makes like 10% commissions on whatever you put with them, So that's like a typical, arrangement for teachers that they're, kind of, susceptible to. And so, salespeople do not really understand that much about financial planning usually. Right? Like they understand about the product they sell, and they understand that they have to sell this product to get paid. But they, in most cases are not like super well versed in, financial planning topics and just things like student debt repayment management. Right. Yeah. So they're going to like sit there and try to give you financial advice, like, oh, put your money here. And like, you're not going to get that advice from financial professionals because, most of the financial planners want to work with the physicians and the attorneys and like the people that have the big incomes that can pay them a lot of money. Right. And so then
the most money to play with.
Right. Exactly. It's like, that's because they charge a flat fee for service. And so the teachers that, could potentially like be able to pay for help, like they're not able to pay as much. And so what happens is you have these like product salespeople that are insurance driven where they make big commissions. And so that kind of works out for them because they can give somebody advice. And instead of having to get paid, a couple $100 a year for like a long time, they can make a couple $1,000 up front all at once, and just be done with you. So that's kind of the model for like how teachers, like how financial professionals like target teachers. And I would say more financial salespeople rather than financial professionals. But so that's why you don't hear about it from them. And then the second reason why you don't hear about it is because, like I just mentioned, like the stuff we just talked about, it's a little bit complicated. You have to really know this stuff about the conflict between teacher loan forgiveness and PSLF to be able to talk about it. And then you also have to know about how the rules would impact your average teacher that's making, 20, 30, 40,000 a year in terms of how much that means that they're going to have to pay. And it actually gets like even more complicated than that. If you're married to somebody else with high income and high student loan debt, for example, like there's all kinds of stuff that can impact things, like Perkins loans, you can get Perkins loans canceled. Sometimes your loans are not all direct. So maybe only some of your loans are eligible for forgiveness and some of them are not. So then, there's just a lot to this, right? So, so I'm excited to keep going through this stuff, try to get people as much free advice as we can.
So I did some research, and because you had mentioned like the direct and Perkins. And so from what I read, they said that you have to have had a direct loan, the correct repayment plan, work in the right job, and make 120 on-time payments. Does that sound about right?
So that's for public service loan forgiveness, right?
Right.
So the Perkins cancellation is a separate thing. So, the Perkins cancellation is just like a totally separate animal. So if somebody has Perkins loans, I would contact like your person that has the Perkins loans and tell them that you want their help setting it up for teacher Perkins forgiveness. Okay. So for the PSLF program, like this is kind of how it works. So basically all loans after 2010, unless they're private student loans, were issued by the government. So anybody that like went to undergrad, you maxed out all your Stafford loans, and then your parent either took out Parent Plus loans to cover the difference, or they took out private student loans, your parents did, to cover like that extra bit, right? And then let's say you went to graduate school, almost surely all of those loans are in your name and they're all direct loans if you took that debt after 2010. Okay. So what happened before that is you had these loans called FFEL. So FFEL loans were before 2010. That was like the typical way that people had student loans from the government back then. And that stuff's not eligible for PSLF. Why is that? It's because it's mostly held by banks. And it's like bank held guaranteed government guaranteed stuff. And so the banks are still getting profits off of that to this day. Right.
Oh, wow.
And so the banks obviously do not want the government to forgive their debt. Right. Yeah. That's like an obvious thing. Right. So they put this little loophole in the PSLF rules that basically said the only stuff that's eligible for, PSLF is direct loans. That's the only thing that can be forgiven. So a lot of the people that had loans from before 2010 had these bank kind of type loans from the federal government that were like, kind of like, like the big mortgage lenders kind of were like sort of governmental kind of things, right? So it's kind of like that, like before 2010. And so all these people are getting denied because they all have the wrong kind of loans that were carved out with this like super weird loophole, like so the banks could keep that on their profit balance sheet and everything. And so that's why people are getting denied right now, is because remember I said before 2010, it was all screwed up. So what's before 2010 plus 10 years? What date is that? Right? 2019 and before.
Yeah, my undergrad wouldn't qualify for that either.
Well, it depends. So we actually, so I just interviewed somebody on our Student Loan Planner podcast, a couple teachers that not just one of them, but both of them just got their loans forgiven tax-free. They both owed like 80 grand each of them, and both of them had their loans forgiven. And how were they lucky enough to have that happen to them? So in like the mid 2000s, like a really nice financial aid person just like happened to steer them towards like the really hard to get government loan, like the direct government loan that like was really difficult to access before 2010. And so, a lot of the most ethical places, like you had to be super ethical to put somebody in direct loans before 2010. So they just happened to get in those kind of loans. And then they happened to be paying on like these payment programs that like income-based repayment, IBR, the kind of the first version of the plan you have to be on for public service loan forgiveness, that actually didn't exist until 2009 at all. So if you had the right kind of loans, you weren't even able to sign up for the right kind of plan that counted towards this program until 2009. So almost nobody had the right kind of loans before 2010. Almost nobody had access to the right kind of repayment program before 2009. Everybody's like super confused because this thing is a big old mess. And so like, this is how all this train wreck happened when everybody started applying, thinking that they like worked for 10 years and they should get their loans forgiven.
Are there any loopholes to that in terms of all of the requirements? Because we talked about how you had to have like the right payment plan, work in the right job, and all of that. I mean, do you have to check every single box perfectly to qualify for PSLF?
Well, yes and no. So they passed the temporary expanded PSLF about a year or so ago, and that made several $100 million available to help people that were kind of screwed over by that process. So here's the problem, right? You have to have had direct loans during the period that you were serving in the public or not-for-profit or government employer, right? So that right away eliminates like 80-90% of people, okay? Because you had to have this like heart of gold financial aid person that puts you in the right kind of loan before 2010 to potentially qualify for this. So then what you have to do is apply to the PSLF program and get denied, okay? So once you're denied, then you send an email to tepslf@fedloan.org, I believe is the email, saying like, I got denied my PSLF. I want my loans forgiven because I've been making payments for 10 years on direct loans, right? And so the couple that I'm interviewing on our podcast, like they took that route and that's how they got their loans forgiven because, they had these loans from mid 2000s, they were on like the extended plan, which was more than what they would have had to have paid if IBR had existed at the time. Right. And so that's why they're getting their loans forgiven under this kind of one-shot, temporary expanded PSLF. What's going to happen, though, is once people start hitting like 2020, once we start hitting that kind of date, you're going to start seeing people that like did master's degree programs in like 2010 to 2011, like 1-year programs and 2-year programs. So like 2020, 2021, 2022, this is when people are going to start ending up doing like or getting loan forgiveness, like just because they had it all set up without having to have a PhD and like all this bureaucratic nonsense, right? So like there's this exponential curve. If you look at all of the approved applications for like the certifications for PSLF, so it's like small, medium, massive, and so there's this huge exponential wave that's coming for loan forgiveness based off of just how Congress structured the program 10 years ago.
Everything that I've been reading, the National Educators Association, they're like, oh, it's not a good idea to go for PSLF because so many people are being denied and it's too rigid. And one person even said, my employer didn't put down the right phone number and I got denied. So do you find that these are common experiences when you're working with teachers, or do you feel because you have knowledge of it and the whole process that you're able to steer them away from making those mistakes?
I mean, the clients that we've advised have not had these problems because we kind of prepare them on like how to fill out the forms and like what to do and how to have everything set up. So, I mean, I haven't personally had anybody that's used our service that's gone through that, but I know that like, so the NEA, like this is a little unfortunate for them to take that position because I think they're going to cost their members billions of dollars in loan forgiveness because they're just not experts in this program, right? So like the NEA is not your financial advisor, right? So, I mean, like they can make comments on like what they think about like legislative programs, but like at the end of the day, like they're not experts in this program at all, right? Like the NEA is just taking sort of like a values-based position on this, which is that teachers are getting denied. This isn't right. It should change, right? What they're not doing is saying like, this is why the PSLF program was broken. This is why it should work for anybody that's, got loans from after 2010, right? This is how you can qualify. Like they're not doing any of the education piece. They're just doing like the lobbying piece, which is important, but like, it's not accurate, because like, again, like it's very clear that if you have direct loans, you're eligible for this. Like if you're on an income-based plan, it's not the 120 payments, by the way, that's not even like consecutive, that's cumulative. So if you took time away to have kids or like you went part-time and like, or you missed payments or like you went into forbearance, that doesn't reset the clock. You literally just come right back where you left off. So also like for summers, like summers count for teachers, like towards those 120 months of payments, as long as you keep the payments going. Also maternity leave or paternity leave, like the 3 months a year of maternity or paternity leave counts towards PSLF too. You know,
Okay.
So there's a lot of stuff in there. I would say that any teacher with more than any teacher definitely with more than $20,000 of student loans absolutely needs to look at this, because I think that you would probably cost yourself like a 5-figure sum by not optimizing this stuff. I'm not exaggerating there.
So then how can we make sure? So let's say that a teacher listening to this episode, once they get started on the process, they're like, oh yeah, I've met my 10-year mark a while ago. I thought I wasn't eligible. How can they make sure that they're going to be approved, assuming they have a direct loan and they made the consecutive payments?
I'll tell you like the way to do it on your own. The way to do it on your own is to go to nslds.ed.gov. So that's a website that you can log into, and you're going to see a table of all your loans, and it's going to list all of your loans on there. And if all of your loans say direct, then you're in great shape. You don't need to do anything to your loans, right?
Okay.
If you go in there and you see that your loans say FFEL, then they're not eligible, right? And anything that says FFEL is not eligible. So, so if you have, let's pretend that you have all FFEL loans, you would need to consolidate them. So you could consolidate them by going to studentloans.gov, right? So you need to make sure you have the right kind of loans. That's first. The second thing would be to send in the PSLF ECF form. So if you Google that term, PSLF ECF form, you're going to get a PDF that you can literally send in to Fed Loan Servicing, and it's going to have the address on there. It's going to be straightforward. Obviously make sure the information is correct on the application. I mean, usually that's like 40% of the reasons for denials is because like someone's supervisor forgot to sign it, or like didn't put the address for the employer on there. It's silly, but like you just need to double check the form, right? And then when you send that in, wherever your loans are in the world, they'll be transferred to Fed Loan Servicing, right? Okay. So they'll get transferred over there, and then you're going to be asked to like sign up for an income-based plan when you're at Fed Loan Servicing. So that's the company that manages the PSLF program. So for most teachers, if you can, I recommend pay as you earn, because it gives you the most flexibility to exclude your spouse's income if you're married one day. So that's like the best advice I can give. But I'm sure there's some listeners that are listening that are like, that sounded like French. I have no idea what he just said. Right. Hence the reason for groups like us existing is like, we'll do it for somebody except for the document preparation. Like we won't do that, but we'll explain exactly how to do it. We'll make sure that it's done right. We'll make sure that you understand like, which path is best. But yeah, I think that like teachers are probably missing out on like, I would guess tens of billions of dollars in loan forgiveness right now, because that there's just lack of awareness. There's lack of like having it set up the right way. Like people are paying stuff off and refinancing stuff when they should be going for forgiveness. Because basically every teacher or almost every teacher is at a not-for-profit or government employer, right? Right. Like there's I guess maybe there's some like for-profit like charter schools or something like that maybe.
Right. In private schools.
Well, private schools are not for profit, right? Like if you're teaching at like a Catholic school or something like that, like you're probably at a not-for-profit employer. You just have to be a 501c3 employer or a government employer. Those are the two rules. So for example, like 501c3 just means that like some rich person could give $1 million and name the school after themselves, right? And deduct it on their taxes. So that's basically every private school anywhere, with it.
It's not just a Title I school then.
No, this is like basically 95% of the teaching profession.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I was under the impression that because of the teacher one that you had to teach at a Title I school to be eligible.
Yeah. I mean, that's why the teacher loan forgiveness sucks.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, excuse my French, but, it's lousy, especially if you have more than 20 grand of debt. Because, if you have 20 grand or less, then maybe like that 5K or the 17,500 is like really awesome. You can just do that plan, get most of it forgiven, pay off the rest when it's gone. Right. But like if you owe more than 20,000 at all, then you really need to pay attention to this stuff, because, you could really seriously get a lot of your debt forgiven. And the only thing that's not eligible is private debt. So that's like stuff that maybe your parents took out in undergrad. I very rarely see a teacher that did a master's degree program where it's not Stafford or Plus loans. It's almost always Stafford or Plus loans when somebody goes to grad school.
Right.
For undergrad, like there's limits on what you can borrow. So for grad school, there's no limits. You can borrow as much as you want from the government. For undergrad, you can only borrow I think it's like 5,000 to 10,000 per year, And so since schools typically cost more than that, like parents will often sign up for private loans that they co-sign. So that's the only situation for, when teachers should definitely pay something back is if it's a private loan.
If you made it this far, then I know that you got so much out of that conversation with Travis, and it's just the first part of our conversation. So here are my key takeaways from what we discussed. First, the teacher loan forgiveness program isn't all it's cracked up to be. I'm sorry to say that, despite the misleading name. If you qualify by teaching in a Title I school for 5 consecutive years, then you can get $5,000 forgiven and up to $17,500 forgiven, but only if you teach math, science, or special ed. So I wouldn't qualify for that. While that seems like a nice chunk, it doesn't really help you if you have tens of thousands of student loans. Next, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program is the best option for all teachers. You pay down your loans for 10 years using the income-based plan, and after 10 years, you can apply to have the rest forgiven. Travis gave us tips on different ways to lower our income base so that your monthly payment on those loans for 10 years is actually less. And finally, there's a lot of misinformation there about these types of loan forgiveness programs, or even worse, I think there's a lack of information. I mean, I've been teaching for 18 years now, and I had no idea that this was even a possibility. So services like those provided at Student Loan Planner can definitely steer you in the right direction so that you can minimize the amount you pay and maximize the amount of debt that's forgiven. This is key. Now, I didn't want to overwhelm you guys with all of this information, so that's why I split the interview into 2 episodes. And I highly recommend that you listen to this one again so that you can really wrap your brain around all of the details about the PSLF program. Next week, Travis and I go into more detail about the program as well as calculate some different scenarios so that you can get a really good idea of just how much you can save. If you want to read more about what Travis and I discussed today, just head on over to teachersneedteachers.com/student loan. And that'll go over all the details that Travis talked about in today's episode. And if you want to contact the Student Loan Planner, you can email them at help@studentloanplanner.com, or you can just head on over to the Student Loan Planner podcast, which has a lot of really valuable information. And be sure to subscribe to this podcast so that you can automatically get next week's episode where I continue the conversation with Travis. Just look at the device you're on right now and hit either that subscribe or follow button right now. Like if you're on Spotify, it says follow, not subscribe. And also, this is important, if you have a teacher bestie who would benefit from knowing how to have their student loans forgiven, you really owe it to them to share this episode with them. They will definitely benefit from this. So thanks for hanging out with me today, you guys, and have a fabulous week.
Thanks for listening to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast. Love this episode? Head over to Apple Podcast or Google Play to subscribe, rate, and leave a review.